Corporate risk is the highest level of risk within the company, which can have an effect across the organization if they are realized. By implementing an effective corporate risk assessment process, we can identify and mitigate possible risks and provide a rational basis for better decision-making in regards to all risks. The object of corporate risk assessment is to ensure that a process is in place for planning and controlling both internal and external corporate risks within BGP Offshore. BGP Offshore has a documented corporate risk assessment procedure called BGPO MP004 Corporate Risk Assessment. This procedure forms part of the risk management system that is used within BGP Offshore. The risk management system is based around the ISO 31000 requirements. By having a structured risk management system that is aligned to ISO 31000, we also meet the requirements identified in IOGP Report 510 Operating Management System Framework Element 5 Risk Assessment and Control. Because risks can have a negative and a positive impact on BGP Offshore, we look to reduce the chance of a negative outcome occurring, but increase the likelihood of a positive outcome. To be able to do this, we need to have a structured approach. Part of this approach is how the company establishes roles and responsibilities. In BGP Offshore, we have a 4-tier organization approach, which is onshore structure, president and vice presidents, directors, managers, and support team. By understanding the different levels in BGP Offshore, we can also allocate levels of responsibilities and accountability for managing and supporting the corporate risk assessment process. Departments have a department matrix of responsibility and accountability. This provides a guide to what is required by each level in the organization to manage corporate risk process. Let's now look at FLAG, which is BGP Offshore's software used to support the business management system and captures all relevant information associated with corporate risk. On BGP Offshore's main page, you will see a corporate risk register that is used by the senior management team. Corporate risk can have a significant impact across the company and usually requires the greatest resources. Typical risks are related to the following: human resources, health and safety, environmental, IT, financial, operational quality, legal, and reputation. Apart from quality and reputation, the areas identified above may have legal requirements to be adhered to and will require the company to have the appropriate business management systems in place to prevent prosecution or fines. Once you have clicked the Corporate Risk Register tab, you will see the current list of corporate risk. To record a new corporate risk, click on New Corporate Risk Register. Management System. This will describe which department process shall be responsible for the management, review, and updating of this risk. In the Objective box, describe the desired outcome for being able to manage the risk and the reason why we want to do this. Hazard. Risk analysis builds on the risk information generated in the identification step, converting it into decision-making information. In this phase, understanding how the risk could impact the business will help in other areas as well. We should describe here all creditable hazards that could be expected. At the corporate level, the outcomes would normally fall into the following: personnel, environmental, assets, reputation, and financial. The risk field. This step in the corporate risk process is to identify the potential positive and negative risks that BGP Offshore may be exposed to. Each department within BGP Offshore is required to list the risks that it sees could impact on the business objectives. During this process, information can be gained from legal requirements, industry-related incidents, and past incidents having occurred in the company. The list can be added to, as it is not expected for any company to know every possible risk it may face. An example of risks at a corporate level would be Knowing the nature of our business, the QHSSE department would state that we have potential risks in the following areas: injury to our personnel, exposing personnel to health issues, having a negative impact on the environment, security issues in the operating zone, and subcontractor management issues. Context. This field will decide if the risk is internal, which BGP Offshore will have more control over, or if the risk is an external risk. If it is an external risk, BGP Offshore may have less control of it occurring. BGP Offshore uses PEARF as a method of categorizing different types of hazards within the company. When attempting to identify risk and hazards, consider people, environment, assets, reputation, and financial. Once hazards and threats have been identified, their causes, consequences, and probability can be estimated, and the risk determined. Analyzing the various risks should be done using the BGP Offshore Risk Matrix. The risks should be analyzed by taking into consideration the likelihood of the risk occurring and the severity that it poses to the company. This should be recorded accordingly in the risk assessment. Severity. The severity rating shall be assessed by first taking into consideration the particular category that the hazard being assessed will have the greatest impact, should the risk be realized. This is divided into 5 categories, and these are people, environmental, assets, reputation, and finance. When the category is identified, there are 5 levels of severity in which a risk may fall, 1 being the lowest level of risk and 5 being the highest. Every category in PEARF has specific conditions associated with each of the 5 levels of risk. Likelihood. Determine the likelihood of an incident, injury, or harm arising from the task by using the risk matrix to rank the likelihood using the subcategories of A. Never heard of in the industry. B. Heard of in the industry. C. Incident has occurred in our company. D. Happens several times a year in our company. And E. Happens several times a year in our location. Risk rating. Once the severity and likelihood have been identified, the risk level can be determined from the risk matrix. As shown in the matrix, risk ratings can range from A1, lowest risk, to E5, highest risk. The purpose of risk evaluation is to assist in making decisions based on the outcomes of risk analysis about which risks need treatment and the priority for treatment implementation. Red, intolerable. The operation should not start or continue until an alternative method has been developed or additional controls have been implemented. Yellow, incorporate risk reduction measures. The operation should start or proceed only when risk-reducing measures are in operation or with specific sanction by management. Green, manage for continuous improvement. The operation may start or proceed with continuous effort to improve. Control measures. For each identified risk, there will be 1 or more strategies or courses of action available. The main strategies that will be selected are as follows: avoidance, risk control, risk transfer, loss reduction, segregation of exposures, spread of risk, duplication of resources, and self-retention. Avoidance. This is the most effective risk management strategy, in that by avoiding an activity or risk, any chance of a loss is eliminated. But avoiding all risk would mean that BGP Offshore could not function. So, if the risks have been properly identified and ranked, then an informed decision can be made as to whether a risk should be avoided. Risk control. This is the process of managing the risk, taking proactive steps to reduce the identified risks where possible, and putting steps, rules, or procedures in place to minimize the residual risk to reduce the chance of a loss or the severity of such a loss. An example of risk control would be to have detailed procedures to manage a risk. Risk control is the most widely used strategy, as when combined with the other strategies, it enables activities or operations to take place with best practices or best process in place to prevent the likelihood of the risk occurring. Risk transfer. This is the proactive process of transferring unwanted risk away from your organization to another person or organization. Risk can be transferred to another party as follows: insurance, using external consultants with greater expertise, purchasing a solution instead of building it, and outsourcing services. Risk transfer does not mean risk elimination. In general, a risk transfer strategy will generate risks that still require proactive management, but reduce the level of risk to an acceptable level. Loss reduction. This is a post-loss process that is essentially a response plan that addresses what will be done if a loss does occur. An effective loss reduction strategy can effectively reduce the impact of a loss. Segregation of exposures. By spreading your exposure to loss across different locations or by isolating certain risks, the chance of a total loss is significantly reduced. Some typical examples of segregation of exposures include, but are not limited to, disperse a particular asset or activity over several locations and regularly rely on that asset or activity as a part of the organization's working resources. Use backups, spares, or copies of critical property, information, or capabilities and keep them in reserve. Duplication of resources. This process involves maintaining backup facilities or having a contingency plan in place in case an unexpected situation interrupts the normal flow of operations. While this strategy can involve maintaining an expensive infrastructure, it is an important strategy to consider for certain critical operations. Self-retention. This process is applied to manage risks that are either uninsurable due to high-risk factors or for small, infrequent losses that can be better managed internally than by claiming through an insurance company. Once the risks have been identified and ranked as previously outlined, then the selection and application of processes can be completed. Usually, various combinations of processes will work together to address the identified risks, and it is not unusual to shift to other processes as new risks become apparent, or more information accumulates on the risk profile of an activity. Extensively and continuously collect internal and external initial information related to corporate risk, including historical data and future forecasts. Relevant functional departments have responsibility to collect initial information. The department director shall assess the risks in the key business and related matters of the department and collate and fill in the corporate and location risk register. The vice president is responsible for reviewing and approving the risk assessment results. To ensure that the risks that have been identified and remain a company or department focus, it is considered good practice to have regular reviews of the risks by the department personnel that are assigned to manage the risk. Such reviews should be recorded in FLAG. Once the corporate risk register has been saved, you will see it on the corporate homepage under the Corporate Risk Register tab. You will also see at the bottom of each individual corporate risk register page 2 additional tabs. These are Notes. Notes allows personnel to add comments or updates about this risk. These can help document issues that may have occurred during corporate risk assessment. Attachments. This tab is for adding supporting documents that relate to this corporate risk. We should make sure that we capture any information that is used to support the process. For instance, if a related supported procedure had been developed, it would be attached here as evidence. This session has now shown you how to enter a corporate risk into FLAG and explained what should be entered. Your QHSSE team can provide further guidance on this process, and you can also revert to the BGPO offshore management procedure for corporate risk assessment.